the skeletal system and synovial joints. The human skeleton protects vital organs, supports the body and provides attachment for muscles, allows movement, is used for red blood cell formation, and stores calcium and energy reserves. The skeleton is divided into two parts: the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, vertebral column, ribs and sternum, and the appendicular skeleton, which includes the arms and shoulder girdle and the legs and hip girdle. The axial skeleton is made up of the skull, which provides protection to the brain, the vertebral column, which protects the spinal cord and allows a wide range of movement, the rib cage, which protects the heart and lungs, and the sternum, which increases the integrity of the rib cage. The appendicular skeleton is made up of arms and shoulder girdle, with the shoulder girdle comprising the clavicle, scapula and humerus, and the legs and hip girdle. The appendicular skeleton permits a wide range of movement. The vertebral column, also known as the spine or spinal column, protects the spinal cord, supports the upper body, allows a wide range of movement, is important for posture, and transmits force to other body parts. The vertebral column comprises 7 cervical vertebrae found in the neck, 12 thoracic vertebrae in the mid to upper back, 5 lumbar vertebrae, which is the lower back, 5 fused sacral vertebrae found in the pelvic girdle, and 3 to 4 bones fused together to make up the coccyx, which is the tailbone. Ossification. The skeleton system of an embryo starts off as cartilage, which is a firm but elastic material that typically cushions bones and joints. As the embryo grows, cartilage gradually changes to bone. The development of bone from cartilage is called ossification. Ossification continues to take place throughout childhood. Ossification replaces and repairs bone throughout life. There are 4 types of bones which make up our skeleton. These include irregular bones, which give the body protection and shape, such as the pelvis or vertebrae. Flat bones, which protect organs, and large muscles can be attached to the flat bones. An example is the scapula or sternum. Short bones, which are used in the fine movements of the body. An example is the carpals and tarsals, which are the wrist and ankle bones. And long bones, which are used for the main movements of the body. An example is the humerus and femur. Let's now look at the gross anatomy of bone. Every bone has a dense outer layer. This external layer is compact bone. Internal to this is spongy bone. The structure of a typical bone include a tubular diapiphysis or shaft, which forms the long axis of the bone. And epiphyses, which are at the bone's ends, which in many cases are more expanded than the diapiphyses. This area of the bone is responsible for bone growth. And membranes, which are the external surface of the bone. Bone is covered and protected by a double-layered membrane called the periosteum. Exercise and bone remodeling. In the adult skeleton, the processes of bone deposit and bone removal form a process known as bone remodeling. This action is coordinated by two opposing groups called osteoblasts, which are bone-forming cells, or cells that are responsible for creating new bone tissue to increase the width and rigidity of bone, and osteoclasts, or bone removal cells, or cells that are responsible for removing damaged bone tissue in preparation for the creation of new bone tissue. Bones are highly adaptable. Their shapes reflect the forces applied to them. Heavily stressed bones become thicker and stronger, whereas bones not subjected to regular stresses will become thin and brittle. Regular exercise is therefore important as a stimulus that maintains normal bone structure and function. Moderate amounts of physical activity and weight bearing are essential to stimulate normal bone maintenance. Degenerative changes in the skeleton occur after relatively short periods of inactivity. After a few weeks, unstressed bones will lose up to a third of their mass. Let's now look at joints. Our skeleton is jointed to allow movement. The three main types of joints are immovable or fibrous joints, slightly movable or cartilaginous joints, freely movable or synovial joints. Synovial joints are the major joints of the body and the joints that are responsible for body movement. Synovial joints are comprised of synovial fluid, an articular capsule, articular cartilage, and ligaments. Synovial fluid. Synovial fluid occupies the free space within a joint. It is responsible for lubricating the joint, allowing friction-free movement, and is utilized for shock absorption. Articular capsule. The articular capsule is a double-layered capsule that encloses the joint cavity. The external layer is a fibrous capsule that strengthens the joint and prevents the bones from being pulled apart. And the internal layer is a synovial membrane which covers all the internal joint surfaces. Articular cartilage. Articular cartilage covers the opposing bone surfaces. Articular cartilage acts as a spongy cushion to absorb compression and protects the bones. Ligaments. Ligaments are bands of tough, fibrous tissue that hold bones together at the joints, limit their range of movement, and prevent dislocation. There are 6 types of synovial joints. Ball and socket joint. An example of a ball and socket joint is the hip joint. A ball and socket joint allows movement in all planes. Hinge joint. An example of a hinge joint is the elbow. A hinge joint allows movement in one plane only. Pivot joint. An example of a pivot joint is the skull on top of the vertebral column. A pivot joint allows rotation only. Saddle joint. An example of a saddle joint is the thumb. Movement is limited due to the shape of the bones. Condyloid joint. An example of a condyloid joint is the wrist. A condyloid joint permits movement in 2 planes. Gliding joint. An example of a gliding joint can be found in the carpal bones, found in the wrist and ankle. Movement occurs when one bone slides on top of another.